Alright, let's go. Number 10. The Olmec. In 1862, a farmer clearing sugarcane in the swampy lowlands of Veracruz, Mexico, struck what he thought was the bottom of an enormous iron cauldron buried in the earth. He dug around it. What emerged from the soil was not a pot. It was a face 9 feet tall, carved from a single block of black basalt, with broad lips, heavy-lidded eyes, and a helmeted brow staring up at the jungle canopy as it had stared for nearly 3,000 years. The face belonged to the Olmec, and it should not exist. Between roughly 1500 and 400 BCE, in the tropical lowlands of southern Mexico, a civilization rose along sluggish rivers and mangrove swamps that archaeologists now call Mesoamerica's mother culture. Everything that would later define the great civilizations of the Americas, the Maya glyphs, the Aztec pantheon, the ball courts, the calendar systems, the concept of zero, the 260-day ritual count. Every one of these traditions can be traced back to the Olmec. They invented the foundational grammar of the New World. The Maya inherited it. The Aztecs inherited it. Half a continent of human civilization stood on the shoulders of a people whose name we do not even know. Olmec is what the Aztecs called them millennia later. It means rubber people. We have no idea what they called themselves. What they left behind is a problem. Across 4 primary sites in the Mexican states of Veracruz and Tabasco, archaeologists have unearthed 17 colossal stone heads. Each one is carved from a single boulder of basalt. Each one is unmistakably a portrait. Individualized features, distinct expressions, headgear that may indicate rank or lineage. The largest stands nearly 11 feet tall. The heaviest weighs an estimated 50 tons. 50 tons. The weight of a fully loaded tractor trailer. Carved from stone with stone, because the Olmec had no metal tools. But the carving is not the impossible part. The basalt did not come from the sites where the heads were found. Geochemical analysis has traced the stone to the Tuxtla Mountains, a volcanic range roughly 60 miles from the ceremonial centers at San Lorenzo and La Venta. 60 miles of dense tropical lowland. 60 miles of seasonal swamp, of meandering rivers, of soft alluvial soil that would not bear the weight of a loaded ox cart, even if ox carts had existed. The Olmec had no wheels. They had no pack animals. There were no horses in the Americas, no oxen, no mules, no elephants, nothing 4-legged and strong enough to pull a 50-ton block across a continent of mud. And yet the heads are there, 17 of them, moved. The leading hypothesis involves wooden rollers, hemp ropes, and rafts floated down rivers during the rainy season, hauled by hundreds of laborers working in shifts. The hypothesis is plausible. It has been modeled, tested at smaller scales, defended in peer-reviewed journals. It is also, by the admission of the archaeologists who propose it, a guess. No Olmec quarry tools have been recovered in situ. No transport infrastructure has been identified along the route. No depictions of the process exist in any surviving Olmec art. The method of transport is still debated. The debate has lasted longer than the Olmec civilization itself was understood to exist, and the heads are only the beginning of what the Olmec left unexplained. At a site called Cascajal, a serpentine block bearing 62 carved symbols was recovered from a gravel pit by road workers. If the symbols are what some epigraphers believe they are, a writing system, then the Cascajal block is the oldest written text in the Western Hemisphere. It cannot be read. It may never be read. The script has no descendants, no Rosetta Stone, no living tradition to inherit it. The Olmec gave the Americas their gods, their numbers, their games, and their words. Then they vanished. Their cities were systematically defaced. Many of the colossal heads were deliberately mutilated, dragged into pits, and buried by hands we cannot identify. Whether by enemies, by descendants, or by the Olmec themselves in some final ritual act, no one knows. The heads sit in museums now, or back in the jungle clearings where they were found, weathered and silent. 17 faces staring out from a culture that invented the foundations of a hemisphere and left no instructions for how any of it was done. Number 9. The Knock. In 1928, a tin miner named Colonel Dent Young was sifting through alluvial deposits on the Jos Plateau in central Nigeria when he pulled a terracotta head from the gravel. It was not what he was looking for. It was the face of a person who had been dead for over 2,000 years, modeled in fired clay with such precision that the individual features were still legible across the millennia. The hair was elaborately coiled. The eyes were hollow triangles staring through him into the savanna light. He had no idea what he was holding. Neither did anyone else. What Dent Young had stumbled onto was the surviving evidence of an entire civilization that academic history had functionally forgotten. The Nok culture flourished across the wooded grasslands of central Nigeria from approximately 1500 BCE to 500 CE. 2,000 years of continuous existence, longer than the span between the founding of Rome and the present day. They produced life-sized, sculpted figures in terracotta, the earliest known sophisticated artistic tradition in sub-Saharan Africa. They smelted iron in furnaces built into the soil of the savanna, placing them among the earliest iron-using societies on the African continent. And until a tin miner tripped over one of their faces in the gravel, the modern world had no record that they had ever existed. The sculptures themselves are extraordinary. Reddish-brown terracotta heads, some nearly life-sized, with hollow triangular eye sockets and parted lips and hairstyles braided into architectural complexity. The features are individualized. These are not stylized icons. They are portraits, particular men, particular women, particular faces from a particular community along the Niger and Benue river systems. The expressions are calm, attentive, almost waiting. The clay was fired at temperatures that demanded careful kiln control. The sculptural anatomy demanded a tradition of craft training that had to have been transmitted across generations of practitioners. Nothing about these objects suggests a primitive or experimental art form. They are the product of a mature civilization at the height of its technical confidence. And then there is the iron. Across the Nok heartland, archaeologists have identified the remains of smelting furnaces, clay-lined shafts dug into the savanna floor, charged with charcoal and ore, capable of reducing iron to a workable metal at a moment in world history when most of the planet was still negotiating with stone. The Nok were doing this before the Roman Empire existed. They were doing it before the Han Dynasty unified China. They were doing it in a region that conventional histories of metallurgy long insisted had received iron technology from elsewhere, an assumption the Nok furnaces quietly dismantle. But here's where the story becomes genuinely disturbing. Around 500 CE, the Nok vanished, not gradually, not through assimilation into a documented successor culture. The sculptures stop, the furnaces go cold, the settlements thin out and disappear from the archaeological record. Researchers have proposed climate change, soil exhaustion from intensive agriculture, overharvesting of the hardwoods required to fuel the iron furnaces. The honest answer is that no one knows. A civilization that had endured for 2,000 years, longer than most empires in recorded history, simply stopped, and the savanna grew back over the evidence. The implications are staggering. If the Nok could be erased so completely that we required a tin miner's accident in 1928 to confirm their existence, the question becomes uncomfortable. How many other civilizations of comparable sophistication once stood in regions where no colonial mining operation ever disturbed the topsoil? How many faces are still waiting in the clay? The terracotta heads sit in museums now, behind glass, their hollow triangular eyes still fixed on some horizon the rest of us cannot see. Number 8. The Minoans, the first European civilization and the volcano that buried it. In 1900, The British archaeologist Arthur Evans began excavating a low hill on the northern coast of Crete called Knossos. He expected, perhaps, a modest Bronze Age settlement. What he uncovered instead was a civilization Europe had forgotten it ever had. Multi-story structures rising from the Cretan soil, corridors twisting in patterns that defied the geometry of every Mediterranean ruin then known, drainage pipes of fired clay running beneath floors that had been laid more than 3,000 years before. Evans had not found a settlement. He had found the first advanced civilization in European history, and almost nothing about it made sense. The Minoans flourished on Crete from approximately 3000 BCE to 1100 BCE. For nearly 2,000 years, while mainland Europe remained a patchwork of villages and tribal confederations, this island civilization built palace complexes of a sophistication that would not be matched on the continent for another 1,000 years after their disappearance. Knossos alone covered an estimated 20,000 square meters. Multi-story buildings rose from its central court. Indoor plumbing carried water and waste through terracotta networks engineered with a precision that European cities would not reproduce until the Roman aqueducts. Light wells, vertical shafts cut through the upper floors, channeled Mediterranean sunlight down into the deepest interior corridors. The palace was not dark. It glowed. The walls glowed too. Frescoes covered them in vivid blues, deep reds, saffron yellows so intense that the pigments still hold their color, where excavators have preserved them. The Minoans painted dolphins leaping across plaster seas. They painted processions of figures in elaborate dress. And they painted the bull leap, the ritual that has defined them in the archaeological imagination ever since. Young athletes, men and women both, vaulting over the horns of charging bulls. Whether the act was sport, ceremony, religious sacrament, or all three, the frescoes do not say. They only show it happening, again and again. Across palace after palace, the Minoans wrote. This is perhaps the most haunting fact about them. They developed a script that archaeologists call Linear A, and they used it for centuries on clay tablets, on stone vessels, on votive offerings left in mountain sanctuaries. Hundreds of inscriptions have been recovered. The signs are clear. The patterns are repetitive enough to suggest a fully functional writing system. And yet, Linear A has never been deciphered. Not in 1900, not in 1950, not in 2024. Every attempt has failed. We can see the Minoans writing to themselves. We cannot read a single word. But here's where the story turns into something genuinely catastrophic. Around 1600 BCE, the volcano on the nearby island of Thera, what is now Santorini, detonated in one of the largest eruptions in human history. The blast obliterated the center of Thera itself and sent tsunamis racing south across the Aegean. The northern coast of Crete, where the Minoan palaces stood, was struck by waves whose force is still being modeled by geologists today. Ash blanketed the island. Harbors were destroyed. The Minoan fleet, the foundation of an economy that had spanned the eastern Mediterranean, was crippled in a single afternoon. The civilization did not die that day, but the wound was mortal. Within a few centuries, the palaces were abandoned, the script went silent, and the Minoans dissolved into the Mycenaean culture rising from the Greek mainland. What survived was the memory. The labyrinthine corridors of Knossos, lit by their strange vertical shafts of sunlight, may have given the Greeks the myth of the Minotaur, the monster at the center of the maze. The sudden destruction of a sophisticated island civilization by water and fire may have given Plato the legend of Atlantis. The Minoans did not vanish from the world. They vanished into it, dissolved into myth, into half-remembered stories of bulls and labyrinths and drowned kingdoms. And the script remains undeciphered. The frescoes still glow on the walls Evans uncovered. The drainage pipes still hold their shape beneath floors no living person built. A civilization that wrote, that engineered, that painted itself in saffron and blue across the walls of palaces older than Homer, sits in the Cretan sun, waiting for someone to read what it left behind. Number 7. The Cucuteni-Trypillia culture and the cities that burned themselves to the ground. Between approximately 5,500 and 2,750 BC, across the rolling plains and forest steppes of what is now Ukraine, Moldova, and Romania, a civilization emerged whose settlements would not be matched in scale anywhere in the world for thousands of years. While the palace builders of Crete were still millennia away from laying their first foundations, while Mesopotamia was still organizing its earliest villages along the Tigris and Euphrates, the people we now call Cucuteni-Trypillia were constructing cities so large that satellite archaeology has only fully grasped their dimensions in the last 3 decades. The megasite at Çatalhöyük in central Ukraine, dated to roughly 3,700 BC, covered approximately 450 hectares and housed an estimated 15,000 people. To put that in context, the largest contemporary settlements in Mesopotamia, the cradle of urban civilization, held a fraction of that population. The Cucuteni-Trypillia cities outsized everything in the ancient world. They predated the first true cities of Sumer by centuries, and they did it without writing, without bronze, without the wheel as we typically understand its application to transport. The layout was unlike anything that came before or after. Aerial surveys and magnetometer mapping have revealed that these settlements were organized in vast concentric rings, sometimes a dozen or more, of 2-story wooden houses arranged in patterns that only become fully legible from the air. Streets radiated outward from central plazas. Public buildings stood at calculated intervals. The geometry was deliberate, planned at a scale that required coordination across thousands of households simultaneously. From a low-flying aircraft today, the ghost outlines of these rings still scar the Ukrainian soil. Perfect circles where perfect circles should not exist. The pottery they left behind is among the most striking in the prehistoric world. Spiral motifs in red, black, and white wind across vessel surfaces in hypnotic geometric arrangements, repeating and folding back on themselves with a mathematical precision that seems almost computational. Figurines, painted ceramics, and ceremonial vessels have been recovered by the tens of thousands. The aesthetic sense was sophisticated. The craft tradition was continuous. The population was enormous. But here's where the conventional model of urban development collapses entirely. Every 60 to 80 years, the inhabitants of these cities burned them to the ground, not by accident, not as a result of invasion or warfare, of which there is remarkably little evidence. The destruction was deliberate, systematic, and total. Houses were filled with combustible material, including pottery and grain stores, and then ignited at temperatures hot enough to vitrify the clay walls. Entire cities of 15,000 people were reduced to ash in coordinated burns that would have required the cooperation of the entire population. And then, on the same scorched ground, they rebuilt. The new city would rise directly atop the cremated remains of the old one, following similar concentric patterns, sometimes for another 2 or 3 generations, before the cycle repeated. Archaeologists have proposed dozens of explanations: ritual renewal, sanitation, soil exhaustion, cosmological calendars tied to generational cycles, spiritual cleansing of the dead. None of them fully account for the scale of what was being destroyed or the consistency of the practice across nearly 3,000 years and hundreds of settlements. The pattern is too uniform to be pragmatic and too sustained to be reactionary. Whatever the Cucuteni-Trypillia people believed, that belief was strong enough to compel them to repeatedly annihilate the largest urban centers on the planet. What makes this particularly disturbing is the implication. We tend to assume that the logic of civilization is cumulative, that cities grow, that infrastructure persists, that the rational arc of human settlement bends toward preservation. The Cucuteni-Trypillia inverted that assumption for 3 millennia. They built the largest cities of their age, and then, on a schedule no surviving record can explain, they set them on fire. By approximately 2750 BC, the culture dissolved. The megasites were not rebuilt. The concentric rings emptied. The painted pottery tradition faded from the archaeological record. Whatever cosmology had driven the burnings, whatever covenant the people had maintained with their own impermanence, went into the ground with them. The spirals on their pottery still turn. The reasons do not. Number 6. The Jiahu. In the central plain of China's Yellow River Valley, beneath layers of silt deposited over 9,000 years, archaeologists uncovered something that rewrote the timeline of human creativity. The site is called Jiahu. The culture that inhabited it flourished between roughly 7,000 and 5,700 BCE, predating the Shang dynasty by 4,000 years, predating the unified Chinese state by even longer. When the Jiahu people were burying their dead with grave goods along the banks of the Huai River, the civilizations that history textbooks credit as the cradle of Chinese culture would not exist for another 200 generations. And yet, what they left behind was not primitive. In the late 1980s, excavators working at Jiahu recovered a series of slender, tubular objects from human graves. They were carved from the wing bones of red-crowned cranes, hollowed, polished, drilled with rows of finger holes, the color of aged ivory. 33 flutes have now been recovered from the site. Several are still playable. When musicologists tested them, the flutes produced a precise tonal scale, not random pitches, not approximations, a structured musical system capable of playing recognizable melodies. The instruments were tuned. The Jiahu were not merely making sound. They were making music with intent, with theory, with an understanding of pitch relationships that wouldn't be formally codified in China for another 6,000 years. These are the oldest playable musical instruments ever recovered anywhere on Earth. The numbers anchor the strangeness. 9,000 years ago, before the wheel, before bronze, before the first city walls of Mesopotamia, someone sat on a riverbank in central China and tuned a flute carved from the wing of a bird. But here's where the standard picture of Neolithic life collapses entirely. In 2004, a team led by archaeological chemist Patrick McGovern at the University of Pennsylvania analyzed organic residues coating the interiors of clay jars excavated from Jiahu burial pits. The chemical signatures were unmistakable. Rice, honey, hawthorn fruit, or grape, fermented together into an alcoholic beverage, a mead, a wine, a brew engineered through deliberate biochemistry by people working 7,000 years before the Shang. This is the earliest direct evidence of fermented beverages anywhere in the human record. The Jiahu were brewing alcohol thousands of years before the dynasties that Chinese historiography traditionally treats as the origin point of Chinese civilization. The implications ripple outward in every direction. To ferment, you must understand storage. You must understand seasonality. You must understand that certain organic processes can be harnessed, controlled, and reproduced. The Jiahu jars are not accidents. They are the residue of a technology. And then there are the shells. Across the Jiahu burial sites, archaeologists have recovered tortoise shells deliberately interred with the dead. Carved into the surface of several of these shells are symbols. Discrete, repeated, intentional marks. Not decorations, not tally scratches. Symbols. One bears a sign almost identical to the Shang dynasty character for eye, carved 4,000 years before the Shang existed. Whether these markings constitute true writing or a proto-writing system remains contested. Some researchers see in them the direct ancestors of the oracle bone script that would emerge in the Yellow River Valley millennia later. Others classify them as symbolic notation that fell short of full language encoding. The debate continues in academic journals. What remains undisputed is that someone at Jiahu carved meaningful signs into bone and shell at a moment when most of humanity had not yet considered the possibility of recording thought in matter. Music, alcohol, possible writing, all of it in one place, by one people 9,000 years ago. The Jiahu were not the ancestors of a civilization that recorded their existence. They left no king lists, no dynastic chronicles, no monuments addressed to the future. Their flutes were buried with the dead. Their jars were sealed in the earth. Their carved shells were placed beside bones that no name has ever been attached to. We know they made the music. We will never hear what it sounded like in full. The melodies stopped when the last player did, and the silence has held ever since. Number 5. The Norte Chico, the civilization that rose from the desert in silence. In 1948, American archaeologist Paul Kosok stood in a barren valley on the central coast of Peru and looked at a series of low, eroded mounds that had been dismissed for decades as natural hills. He suspected they were not natural at all. He was correct. What lay beneath the wind-blown sand and pale gravel of the Supi Valley was a city, not a village, not a ceremonial outpost, a city, and it had been built at the same time as the pyramids of Giza. For over 50 years after Kosok's initial observation, the site remained largely unexplored. Then, in 1994, Peruvian archaeologist Ruth Shady Solis began systematic excavations at the site now known as Corral. What her team uncovered in the years that followed rewrote the archaeological history of an entire hemisphere. Radiocarbon dating of reed fibers from the construction fill returned dates between 3,500 and 1800 BCE. The Norte Chico civilization, named for the 4 river valleys in which its sites cluster, was the oldest known civilization in the Americas. It had emerged in complete isolation from the cultures of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus, and it had done so at precisely the same moment in human history. The scale is difficult to absorb. Corral covers more than 60 hectares. 6 terraced pyramids rise from the valley floor, the largest standing 18 meters tall with a base spanning the length of 4 football fields. Sunken circular plazas, carved into the earth like inverted amphitheaters, anchor the ceremonial heart of the city. Residential complexes radiate outward. The construction technique was ingenious and unprecedented. Workers wove cone-shaped reed bags called shikra, filled them with stones quarried from the surrounding hills, and stacked them in massive retaining structures. The bags absorbed seismic energy in this earthquake-prone coast. Pyramids built on shikra foundations have stood for nearly 5,000 years. But here is where the standard model of civilization collapses entirely. The Norte Chico had no pottery. None. In a civilization spanning 2,000 years and dozens of urban centers, archaeologists have recovered no ceramic vessels, no fired clay, no kiln work of any kind. They had no writing, not even pictographs or protoglyphs on stone. And most disturbingly to the conventional framework, they have left no evidence of warfare, no fortifications, no weapons designed for human combat, no depictions of conquest, no mass graves, no burned settlements. Across thousands of years of urban habitation, the archaeological record is silent on the violence that supposedly drives the rise of every complex society. What they had instead were knots. The Norte Chico used the quipu, a system of knotted cords in which color, position, knot type, and spacing encoded information. A quipu fragment recovered at Corral has been dated to roughly 2,500 BCE, making it possibly the earliest known form of record-keeping in the Americas, and one of the earliest anywhere on Earth. The Inca would still be using descendants of this system 4,000 years later. The information held in those knots, like the language of the people who tied them, remains undeciphered. The implications are staggering. The standard archaeological narrative insists that civilization arises through a familiar sequence. Agricultural surplus produces social hierarchy. Hierarchy produces warfare. Warfare produces fortified cities and written records to track tribute and conquest. Pottery enables storage. Storage enables wealth. Wealth enables kings. The Norte Chico violates this sequence at every step. They built monumental architecture without pottery. They organized thousands of laborers without writing. They sustained urban life for 2 millennia without measurable violence. And they did all of this on an arid coastal strip where rainfall is nearly non-existent, sustained by irrigation canals and a diet drawn heavily from the Pacific. And they did it at the same time. The same moment in human history when Khufu's workers were dragging limestone blocks across the Giza Plateau, when Sumerian scribes were pressing the first cuneiform into wet clay, when the bricklayers of Harappa were measuring out their grid streets, a people on the other side of the planet, who could not have known any of these others existed, were raising terraced pyramids from a desert valley and recording their world in knotted string. Something was happening to the human species in those centuries. Something synchronized. Something that left fingerprints on 4 continents simultaneously, in cultures that had no contact with one another and no shared inheritance to draw from. The pale stone pyramids of Corral still rise from the Supi Valley in the dry Peruvian sun, and the people who built them remain anonymous, unwritten, unknown. They left us their architecture and their knots. They left us no explanation for why they began. Number 4, the Vinča culture and the writing that shouldn't exist. In 1908, Serbian archaeologist Miloje Vasić began excavating a low mound on the banks of the Danube River, just outside Belgrade. The site was called Vinča Belo Brdo, and what he pulled from its soil over the following decades would quietly rearrange the timeline of human civilization, though almost no one outside academic circles would ever hear about it. Vasić unearthed thousands of artifacts from a culture that had no business existing where and when it did. Clay figurines with elongated masked faces, copper tools forged with sophistication that predated Mesopotamian metallurgy, and most disturbing of all, small clay tablets and pottery fragments inscribed with symbols. Symbols that looked unmistakably like writing. The Vinča culture flourished across the Balkans between approximately 5,700 and 4,500 BCE. Its heartland stretched along the Danube through what is now Serbia, with satellite communities extending into Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Bosnia. At its peak, the culture sustained settlements housing thousands of people, with timber-framed houses arranged in tidy parallel rows along the riverbanks. Streets, property divisions, granaries, workshops. This was not a scattered tribal society. This was urban planning, 2,000 years before the first ziggurats of Sumer. The figurines alone would have made Vinča remarkable. Archaeologists have recovered tens of thousands of them across the culture's range. Stylized human forms with triangular faces, almond-shaped eyes, and what many researchers interpret as masks pressed against featureless skulls. The figures stare across millennia with an expression that is neither welcoming nor hostile. Just patient. Just present. Their meaning has been debated for over a century. Ritual objects, ancestor effigies, deities, toys. No consensus has emerged. The people who shaped them are gone. The metallurgy is where the standard chronology begins to crack. At sites like Plochnik in southern Serbia, excavations have recovered copper tools, axes, chisels, and ornaments dating to the late 6th millennium BCE. Smelting furnaces have been identified. The Vinča were not cold hammering surface copper. They were extracting metal from ore, controlling temperatures, alloying, casting. This is industrial knowledge, and it appears in the archaeological record, centuries before the Near Eastern cultures, traditionally credited with inventing metallurgy, show any comparable evidence. The Bronze Age was supposed to begin in Mesopotamia. The story has always moved from east to west. The Vinča evidence runs in the wrong direction. But here's where the standard model of human development collapses entirely. In 1875, decades before Vasić's excavations, researchers began noticing strange marks on Vinča pottery and clay tablets, repeating signs, combinations, sequences that appeared too patterned, too deliberate, too consistent across sites separated by hundreds of kilometers to be decoration. By the 1960s, the Romanian archaeologist Nicolae Vlasa, working at Tartaria in Transylvania, recovered 3 small clay tablets covered in these symbols from a sealed ritual deposit. Radiocarbon dating placed the deposit at approximately 5,300 BCE. The Sumerian cuneiform tablets at Uruk, long considered the birthplace of writing, would not appear for another 2,000 years. The Vinča symbols, sometimes called the Danube script, number over 200 recognized signs. They appear on pottery, figurines, spindle whorls, and ritual objects across hundreds of sites. They follow rules. Certain signs cluster together. Others never appear in combination. The patterns suggest grammar. Whether they represent fully developed writing, a proto-writing system, or a complex symbolic notation remains contested. What is no longer contested is their age. The symbols predate every other known writing system on Earth by a margin so wide that the conventional narrative of literacy emerging in Mesopotamia and radiating outward becomes geographically impossible. The implications are staggering. If the Vinča were writing, smelting copper, and building planned settlements 2 millennia before the cultures we credit as the cradles of civilization, then the entire map of human development is drawn wrong. The story we tell ourselves about progress, about the slow ascent from stone tools to literacy moving down the Fertile Crescent and outward to the world, has the arrows pointing in directions the evidence does not support. Something extraordinary happened on the banks of the Danube in the 6th millennium BCE, and then it stopped. By around 4,500 BCE, the Vinča culture dissolved. The settlements were abandoned or absorbed. The script disappeared. The metallurgical tradition fragmented and migrated. Within a few centuries, the knowledge that had distinguished the culture was scattered across Europe in pieces too small to reassemble. The people who shaped the masked figurines, who smelted the first copper, who may have invented writing itself, walked away from their riverside towns and vanished into the larger churn of European prehistory. Their tablets still exist. They sit in museum cases in Belgrade and Bucharest, marked with signs no living human can read. The symbols watch from behind glass, ordered, patterned, deliberate, waiting for a translation that has never come. Number 3, the Indus Valley, the silent giant of the ancient world. In the 1920s, archaeologists working in the dust of British colonial India began uncovering the outlines of cities that no one had remembered. Not in scripture, not in oral tradition, not in any surviving text from any neighboring civilization. The mounds at Harappa in the Punjab and Mohenjo-Daro along the lower Indus had been mistaken for natural hills for thousands of years. When the excavations cut into them, an entire civilization emerged from the soil. Streets laid out in grids, drains running beneath the pavement, brick walls aligned with a precision that suggested centralized planning on a scale the ancient world was not supposed to possess. The Indus Valley civilization, also called the Harappan civilization, after the first site identified, flourished from approximately 3,300 to 1,300 BCE. At its peak, it covered over 1.25 million square kilometers, stretching across what is now Pakistan and northwest India. That single number deserves a moment to settle. The Harappan world was larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. The pharaohs and the Sumerian city-states, the two civilizations that have dominated every textbook account of early urban life, occupied a fraction of the territory controlled by a culture most people have never heard named aloud. The numbers continue. Mohenjo-Daro alone may have housed 40,000 inhabitants at its height. The bricks used to build it were standardized in dimensions across the entire civilization, not just within a single city. A brick made in a kiln near the Arabian Sea matched the proportions of a brick made 1,000 kilometers inland. Someone, somewhere, had established a unit of measurement and enforced it across a territory the size of Western Europe. The streets ran at right angles. The houses had private wells and bathing platforms. Beneath the pavement, the world's first known urban sanitation systems carried wastewater away from the homes through covered brick drains. At a moment when most of the planet's inhabitants were defecating in fields, the Harappans were engineering plumbing. At the center of Mohenjo-Daro sat the Great Bath, a watertight sunken pool 12 meters long, sealed with bitumen and lined with finely fitted brick. No one knows what it was for. It may have been ritual. It may have been civic. It may have been something for which we have no surviving word in any language. Harappan trade goods, beads of carnelian, bolts of cotton, shipments of timber, traveled by sea and overland to Mesopotamia, where Sumerian tablets refer to a distant land called Meluha that almost certainly meant the Indus. The Harappans were known to their contemporaries. Their contemporaries left records of them. They left no readable records of themselves. But here's where the standard model of early civilization collapses entirely. The Harappans wrote. Their script appears on thousands of small seals, on pottery, on copper tablets, a corpus of around 400 distinct symbols repeated across the entire territory for over 1,000 years. It has never been deciphered. No bilingual inscription has ever been found. No Rosetta Stone, no surviving descendant language has been confidently linked to it. The Harappans speak to us, and we cannot hear them. Every other major early civilization left a voice we eventually learned to read. The Harappans left a silence that is held for 4,000 years and shows no sign of breaking. And then there is what the excavations did not find. No palaces, no royal tombs, no grand temples, no triumphal art depicting kings standing over conquered enemies, no mass graves from sacked cities, no defensive walls oriented against invading armies. Across a civilization larger than Egypt and Mesopotamia combined, lasting for 2,000 years, archaeologists have recovered almost no evidence of warfare, kings, or organized religion as we understand those terms. The weapons that have been found are modest, suited to hunting or personal defense, not to armies. The cities show no destruction layers from conquest. The art depicts animals, dancers, abstract figures. No god kings, no emperors, no conquerors. A civilization the size of a continent, organized to the millimeter, trading across oceans, writing in a script no one can read, governed by no ruler we can name, worshipping no god we can identify, and waging no wars we can detect. The Harappans built something the ancient world was not supposed to be capable of building, and they did it in a silence so complete that we cannot even ask them why. Around 1900 BCE, the cities began to empty. The grids fell out of use. The drains clogged. The script disappeared. Whatever the Harappans were became something else, and the something else did not write it down.
Number 2.
Çatalhöyük. In 1958, British archaeologist James Mellart was surveying the Konya Plain of south-central Turkey when he noticed a low, double mound rising from the flat agricultural landscape. There were no monuments, no standing walls, no obvious reason for the swelling in the earth. When excavations began 3 years later, the mound revealed itself as one of the most disorienting human settlements ever uncovered. A proto-city that housed up to 8,000 people. A place that operated under rules so unlike our own that the term city begins to fracture in its presence. Çatalhöyük was occupied from approximately 7,500 to 5,700 BCE. For nearly 2,000 years, generation after generation lived, died, and were buried in the same compressed footprint of mud brick. The settlement predates the Egyptian pyramids by more than 4,000 years. It predates the Sumerian city-states by nearly 3,000. It predates writing itself, and it had no streets. This is the detail that resists comprehension. The houses were pressed against one another in a dense honeycomb of mud brick walls, sharing surfaces with their neighbors on every side. There were no alleys, no lanes, no public squares between dwellings. To enter a home at Çatalhöyük, you climbed onto the rooftops, walked across the interlocking ceilings of the entire settlement, and descended through a hole in the roof using a wooden ladder. The roofs were the streets. The city was inverted. Imagine the scene at dusk. Thousands of people moving across an undulating surface of rooftops. Smoke rising from openings, cut into the mud-plastered ceilings. Ladders pulled up behind them as they descended into the dark interiors of their homes. No facades faced the public. No grand entrances. No avenues for processions. The entire concept of a street, the foundation of every city that would follow for the next 9,000 years, simply did not exist here. Inside the houses, the strangeness deepens. The walls were smoke-blackened from cooking fires, layered with replasterings that built up over decades like geological strata. Across that plaster surface, the inhabitants painted red ochre handprints, geometric patterns, hunting scenes, vultures descending on headless human figures. And on one wall, archaeologists uncovered what may be the oldest landscape painting in the world, a depiction widely interpreted as a map showing the settlement itself beneath an erupting volcano. A city painting, a portrait of its own existence 8,000 years before recorded history began. Bull skulls were mounted into the walls themselves, their horns protruding into living spaces, plastered over and reshaped until they emerged from the architecture as though the building had grown them. And beneath the floors, beneath the platforms where families slept and ate and raised their children, were the dead. The inhabitants of Çatalhöyük buried their ancestors directly beneath their homes. Tightly flexed bodies placed in shallow pits under the sleeping platforms. Mothers, fathers, infants, elders returned to the earth of the house itself. Some skulls were later removed, replastered with clay to reconstruct the features of the face, painted with red ochre, and kept above ground. Held, passed between households, carried through the generations as objects of memory and presence. The living slept above the dead. The dead were not gone. They were architecture. But here is where Çatalhöyük becomes genuinely disorienting to modern assumptions. In nearly 2 millennia of occupation, in a settlement of up to 8,000 people, archaeologists have found no palaces, no temples, no central administrative buildings, no royal tombs, no evidence of kings, priests, or rulers of any kind. Every house is roughly the same size. Every house contains the same domestic features. Every house buries its own dead. The social hierarchy that every textbook insists must accompany urban life is simply absent from the record. A city of thousands, sustained for 2,000 years, without rulers, without temples, without streets, without the things we have been taught are inseparable from the very definition of civilization. The people who built it left no script we can read. We know what they painted, what they ate, what they kept beneath their floors. We do not know what they called themselves, what they believed about the skulls they replastered, or why they chose to build a city that turned its back on every architectural instinct that would follow. They are gone. The mound remains. And every assumption about how human society must be organized stands on ground that Çatalhöyük quietly refuses to support. Number 1. Göbekli Tepe. In 1994, a Kurdish shepherd tending his flock on a dusty hilltop in southeastern Turkey noticed something strange protruding from the soil. A stone, too regular, too deliberate, too clearly shaped by hands to be natural. The shepherd reported the find. German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, then working with the Istanbul branch of the German Archaeological Institute, arrived to investigate. What he uncovered over the following decades on a barren rise called Göbekli Tepe would force the rewriting of every textbook on the origin of human civilization. The site dates to approximately 9,600 BCE. To grasp what that number means, the comparisons have to be laid out plainly. Göbekli Tepe predates Stonehenge by roughly 6,000 years. It predates the Egyptian pyramids by 7,000 years. It predates the invention of pottery. It predates the invention of agriculture. It predates the wheel. It was built by hunter-gatherers, people who chased game across the Anatolian plateau and gathered wild grains, people who had no cities, no writing, no domesticated animals, no fields. And yet, on a windswept hill above the Heron Plain, they raised something that should not have existed for thousands of years. T-shaped limestone monoliths rise 18 feet into the air, arranged in massive concentric circles. Some of the pillars weigh as much as 20 tons. They were quarried from the surrounding bedrock, shaped with stone tools, hauled up the hillside, and set into precise geometric configurations by people who, according to the established model of human development, should not have possessed the social organization to coordinate such labor. There were no kings. There were no scribes. There were no granaries to feed a workforce. The conventional prerequisites for monumental construction were absent. The monuments exist anyway. The carvings on the pillars are the second shock. Foxes coil along the stone in low relief. Snakes slither in vertical columns. Vultures spread their wings across surfaces that should be blank. Scorpions, lions, wild boars, cranes, an entire bestiary of the late Pleistocene rendered in stone by people who had never written a word. The figures are not crude. They are confident, stylized, executed with the assurance of an artistic tradition that must have existed for generations before the first chisel touched the limestone at Göbekli Tepe. The site is not the beginning of something. It is the visible portion of something older that we cannot see. The numbers compound the unease. Ground-penetrating radar surveys have identified at least 20 stone circles beneath the surface, only a fraction of which have been excavated. The hilltop is artificial in part. The builders deliberately buried their own monuments, filling the enclosures with rubble and soil for reasons no one understands. The site was not abandoned to time. It was sealed by the people who built it, carefully, deliberately, as if they were hiding it, or protecting it, or finishing something the rest of us were never meant to read. But here's where the standard model of human development collapses entirely. For a century, the foundational assumption of archaeology has been straightforward. First came agriculture, then came surplus, then came settled life, then came social hierarchy. Then, finally, came religion and monumental architecture as expressions of an already established civilization. Göbekli Tepe inverts the sequence. The temple came first. The fields came after. Genetic studies of einkorn wheat, one of the founding crops of Old World agriculture, trace its domestication to the slopes of Karaka Dağ, a mountain visible from the summit of Göbekli Tepe. The first farmed grain in human history was domesticated within sight of the world's first temple. The implication, advanced by Schmidt before his death in 2014 and refined by his successors, is that agriculture did not produce religion. Religion produced agriculture. The need to feed the workforce that built and maintained the sanctuary may have driven hunter-gatherers to settle, to cultivate, to surrender their nomadic lives. The pillars came first. The wheat followed. The implications extend further than the timeline. If Göbekli Tepe is the work of hunter-gatherers, then the cognitive, organizational, and spiritual capacities we associate with civilization existed in human beings tens of thousands of years before they were expressed in stone. The site is not the invention of those capacities. It is their first surviving record. How many similar sanctuaries existed during the previous tens of thousands of years of human prehistory, built in wood, in earth, in materials the climate has long since erased? How many generations of carvers and builders and ritual specialists left no trace because the medium of their work did not endure? Göbekli Tepe is not the dawn of human complexity. It is the moment when human complexity finally chose a material that could outlast its makers. The builders are gone. Their language is gone. Their names for the foxes and vultures carved into the pillars are gone. The meaning of the circles, the reason for the burial, the identity of whatever they worshipped or feared or memorialized on that hill, all of it is gone. What remains is the stone. 18 feet of carved limestone standing in the wind of the Anatolian plateau, the golden hills rolling away in every direction, the bedrock from which it was cut still visible at the quarry. The monoliths are still there. They have been there for nearly 12,000 years. They were there before the pyramids, before writing, before the wheel, before the village. They were there before history began, waiting for the moment when a shepherd would notice a stone that looked too deliberate, and the rest of us would finally begin to ask what we had forgotten. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.